At the end of 1960, the American people elected a new leader by the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. On the 20th of January 1961, Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States of America. But the maelstrom he was about to enter had many of its problems beginning in 1959. Cuba was being led by a government under the leadership of Fulgencio Batista, who had come to power in a coup. Batista oversaw a government that allowed the gap between the poorest and the wealthiest to widen while its own profits increased. It was a corrupt government, heavily involved with organised crime, but at the same time receiving support from the US, who provided both money and arms. To keep control of an ever-increasingly suppressed people, Batista used imprisonment, torture and execution, with some estimates giving a total of over 20,000 people killed. Finally, in 1958, the people of Cuba staged a revolution that saw Fidel Castro take power in February 1959. Once in power, Castro turned to Cuba's nearest neighbour, but after being snubbed by President Eisenhower, he aligned himself to the Marxist-Leninist socialist state of the Soviet Union, who pumped money into the country and brought communism to the doorstep of America. President Kennedy's aggressive policy against the Cuban leadership would lead to Castro asking Russia for protection, which in turn led to the Soviets placing nuclear missiles on Cuban soil, an action that would bring the world closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Unlike Cuba, the people of Tibet were not reveling in newfound freedom. They were under the control of the People's Republic of China, and the resentment of this control erupted in March of that year into protests. Unlike Berlin and Korea, the United Nations did not intervene, and so with no outside help, the Tibetan uprising was swiftly suppressed by China. The aftermath saw imprisonment, torture and execution, while thousands of other Tibetans, including the Dalai Lama, fled their country for a life in exile. Whilst America was expanding its own influence on the ground, with both Alaska and Hawaii being admitted into the Union in 1959, concerned American citizens were worrying that their borders no longer seemed safe from communist infiltration. It was circling above their homes every 90 minutes and ensconced just 90 miles from their mainland. It was also apparent that people around the world were looking on and seeing the communist system beating supposedly the most advanced system in the world. Communism was looking very appealing to countries starting down the path of independence. With the Soviets basking in the glow of worldwide admiration at their feats in space, America responded by sending out the call for men to volunteer from the US Armed Forces for a special assignment. 7 Cold War warriors were chosen to go into battle against Khrushchev's onslaught on space, and on the 9th of April 1959 they were introduced to the world for the first time. With manned spaceflight promising to bring in an exciting and inspirational new age, events on Earth were still being dominated by man's basest desire to make war and kill their fellow man. In Southeast Asia, on the 8th of July 1959, Viet Cong guerrillas conducted an attack on a base just northeast of Saigon. During this attack, the first deaths took place of Americans by the enemy in Vietnam. The deaths would signal the start of an escalating casualty list in a country that would continue to claim lives in a Soviet-backed war right up until the 29th of April 1975, when 21-year-old Charles Mahman and 19-year-old Darwin Judge were killed. The Soviets could also claim a kind of victory against the Americans when it came to the Apollo moon landings. By backing the Vietnamese, the Soviets helped continue a war that saw the deaths of tens of thousands of American military personnel, and see any pro-American propaganda from the moon landings swallowed up by the supremely anti-American sentiment the war generated around the world. One example of this is the fact that Apollo 12 was sharing the headlines with the My Lai massacre. America may have taken one small step on the Sea of Tranquility, but in Vietnam they had shot themselves in the foot. Ultimately, a program of space exploration to demonstrate America's superiority over the communist system was prematurely cancelled because of a crippling expensive war that had been started to stop the spread of communism. In September 1959, the idea of landing a man on the moon was still very much a dream, but a dream that came one step closer when the Soviet Luna 2 spacecraft became the first man-made object to complete the journey from the surface of the Earth to the surface of the moon. At the time of this success, Khrushchev was visiting the US, and he taunted the American effort by saying, "We have beaten you to the moon, but you have beaten us in sausage making." Khrushchev had a point. The Americans would not be able to achieve the same feat until April 1962. In October, the Soviets once again sent a spacecraft to the moon, only this time Luna 3 was able to return an image of the never-before-seen far side of the moon. While the Soviets amazed the world with their continuing space spectaculars, the Americans were conducting experiments aimed at answering the threat posed by nuclear weapons coming down from space. Using the orbiting Explorer 6 satellite as a target, they launched a bold Orion anti-satellite missile into space from its B-47 carrier aircraft. Coming within 4 miles of its target, the test was considered a success, but the program would fall foul of President Eisenhower's wish to keep space free of military involvement. Even at this early stage, the Soviets were using their space efforts to grab headlines, while the Americans were utilizing it for practical matters. This attention-seeking attitude to space would mean that by the end of 1959, even though the Americans had launched more spacecraft into orbit, the Soviet feats were far more impressive. Russia was apparently winning the space race. One man who apparently fell for the draw of communism was making his own journey in October 1959. Turning his back on his own country, an insignificant little man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. As the 50s ended and the 60s began, it promised to be an age of new exploration in space. 1960 would see the launch of further Soviet spacecraft in preparation for their manned launch attempt. Under the cover of secrecy or just general misinformation, they tested the Vostok spacecraft with varying degrees of success. On the American side, the Saturn rocket program was initiated by President Eisenhower, and NASA was working on ideas for a manned lunar landing program. But as future astronaut Donald Slayton would write, for most of 1960, however, this was one step away from daydreaming. On the 28th of July, 1960, Hugh Dryden, who was the Deputy Administrator of NASA, made the public announcement that the manned lunar landing program, the rather unimaginative title given to it by a committee in 1959, would now formally be known as Apollo. The program now had a name, but it still had a long way to go before it became a tangible aim for the United States. As 1960 waned, the view of the incumbent government was one of apathy towards a manned space program. The thinking being that unmanned spacecraft would yield vastly more scientific data than manned missions. President Eisenhower did support the Saturn rocket program, but saw this as a way of closing the rocket capability with the Soviets. As his term came to an end, he even questioned the need for any further manned flights after the Mercury program was completed. He had seen the estimates for NASA's proposed moon flights and was aghast at the multi-billion-dollar price tag. With the backdrop of uncertainty and even hostility from the outgoing administration and lack of interest being shown by the incoming administration, NASA ploughed ahead with its planned for a moon program aimed sometime in the mid-70s. 1961 saw the start of John F. Kennedy's presidency, and while the American people chose youth, vitality, inspiration and hope as defining qualities for their leader, the people under the red flag had no such choice. President Kennedy was a strong believer in freedom, and he saw communism as a power that sought to remove the freedom of the individual. The new president was fully aware of the kind of adversaries that he faced and the high stakes that he was playing for when he said, "We face a relentless struggle in every corner of the globe that goes far beyond the clash of armies or even nuclear armaments." As the leader of the free world, it was now up to President Kennedy to rise up and meet the threats posed around the world by communism, and also to counter the victories being won in the space race by the Soviets. Less than 3 months later, on the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin rocketed into space, causing a sensation around the world and once again shaking America to its core. As the charming and charismatic Gagarin toured the world, and Khrushchev once again extolled the virtues of Soviet success in space, it became clear that the problem of appearing second in the space race was not going away. During the 1960 presidential campaign, Kennedy had lambasted the Republicans for not narrowing the missile gap, and for the appalling deficiency in America's response to the Soviets' lead in space. Now that he was the president, Kennedy had to find an answer that would propel America into the lead. Just days after Gagarin's flight and subsequent triumphant welcome back to Moscow by a jubilant Khrushchev, American prestige around the globe suffered a further bloody nose when a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba was met and overpowered by the Cuban army. The communist regime of Castro captured or shot the anti-communist Cuban exiles in what would become known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. To compound the failure of the invasion, the US sent no help for the would-be overthrowers of Castro's regime. For a man driven by success, the start of Kennedy's presidency had been marked by failure. Politically, President Kennedy had taken a beating, and he was beginning to look like a weak leader. He needed to turn around the fortunes of his presidency and prove that having taken up the torch for a new generation, he was up to the job. One of the things he needed to address was the lead of the Soviets in space, as he highlighted by saying, "We did not make a major effort in this area for many years, and we are now behind and paying the price of having the Soviet Union exploit a great propaganda advantage with the flight of Sputnik, as well as the flight of Mr. Gagarin." In the very earliest weeks of his presidency, Kennedy had held back from agreeing to the Apollo spacecraft because NASA had done little so far to demonstrate its competency at putting a man into space, and the Russians had not raised the stakes from unmanned spacecraft to manned spacecraft. In the short term, Russia was already ahead in the space race with its far more powerful rockets, and they could probably dominate any Earth orbital goals, so competing with them there was pointless. President Kennedy asked his vice president, "Is there any other space program that promises dramatic results in which we could win?" The prospect of a race to a landing on the moon would not only give America breathing space in which to catch up, it would also offer the best chance for America to beat the Soviets in space, because their technology was superior despite what the initial successes of the Russians might imply. On top of this, the emphasis would be taken off what was happening today and redirected onto the moon race. The lead in space would not be judged on space spectaculars in Earth orbit, which the Soviets could continue to pull off, but on which country was doing the most to get to the moon. But before any moon landing program could be announced, there was the small matter of actually putting an American into space. Up stepped Alan Shepard, who, with the world watching, squeezed into his Freedom 7 spacecraft and propelled America into the manned spaceflight business on the 5th of May 1961. President Kennedy knew the prestige and influence that could be garnered from space propaganda, and stated,
"Finally, if we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take."
President Kennedy also knew that the next decade was going to be crucial because communism was being aggressively pushed around the globe, and America could not suffer a decade of humiliation similar to that suffered following Sputnik. To this end, the decade would be spent catching up with and overtaking the Soviets in space, culminating with a landing on the moon. The moon landing would be America's answer to the Soviets' expansion into space and would stop the harm being done to America's standing around the world. With the successful flight of Mercury Redstone 3 behind them, President Kennedy set America on a course for the moon by delivering some of the most electrifying words to ever be heard in a political speech.
"I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth."
For one moment, Everything that was needed for such an address to be made existed in America. Public support, political support, and a genuine reason to do it. Perhaps only in the year 1961 did these unique circumstances exist, and would lead to a national effort by America to a moon landing program. Only a few years later, the American public would grow weary of war, amid a growing counterculture away from unwavering support of the state and towards rebellion against the government, its military, and the establishment. The Apollo moon landing was just another weapon to fight communism in the new realm of space, and as predicted, as the space race gave way to the moon race, America's superior technology saw them take the lead in August 1965, when the Gemini 5 mission spent over a week in space. This lead was further hammered home by the rendezvous mission of the joint Gemini 7 and 6 missions, and the docking mission of Gemini 8. Humans had long dreamed of what it would be like to journey to the surface of the moon, and it would take a bitter battle between ideologies to make that dream a reality on the 20th of July 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stirred up the dust on the lava plain of tranquility.